the next few weeks, I want to explore presidential transitions throughout American history and deal with some of the really good ones and some of the really bad ones. The worst, the absolute worst, was in 1932 and 33, when Herbert Hoover turned over the White House to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The campaign between them had been bitter, and in the aftermath of in the thick of the Great Depression, Hoover was vilified and Roosevelt vilified him, and it was a very, very bloody contest. But that was nothing compared to the transition. At that time, there was a very long interregnum between Election Day and Inauguration. The Election Day was, as always, early November, and the inauguration was in March, not late January like it is now. And in fact, because this transition was so rocky, they changed the Constitution and moved the inauguration up to the end of January. What was happening was the country was recovering from the Great Depression, and some conservatives, particularly Amity Shales on the Wall Street Journal editorial board, wrote a book called The Forgotten Man, where she argues that there was a real recovery happening. That the Great Depression had really finally broken. And there is some evidence that the economy was on its way back. But Roosevelt, in his campaign, had been very reluctant to make any commitments about the stability of the dollar. He refused to say that we would stay on the gold standard, which we were, and he refused to rule out inflation as a means of solving the problem of low prices during the Depression. And his comments about shaking up the banking system and about possibly monkeying with the currency really scared Wall Street half to death. This was 1933, and as recently as 1896, 40 years before, there'd been a major move to replace the gold standard with a gold and silver standard, which would have had massive inflation in the economy, and that was only narrowly beaten back when McKinley defeated William Jennings Bryan. So now, this concept of abandoning the sound dollar was really scary. And Wall Street went into a total tailspin, and the banks around the country began to be subject to runs, to people running to the bank to try to withdraw their money before the bank failed. This was in the era before federal deposit insurance. So if your bank failed, you lost all your money, every red cent of it. And a number of banks started to fail. Earlier in the period, the Bank of the United States, a largely Jewish bank in New York, had failed. And now banks around the country began to fail because of the panic generated, the Republicans said, by Roosevelt's remarks during the campaign. And that panic, of course, fed on panic. Hoover then contacted Roosevelt and said, let's meet together and formulate a joint plan to bolster the economy and to reassure the banks and the public that we are not going to debase the dollar. And FDR saw that as a plan by Truman to entrap him and to stop him from pursuing the New Deal agenda. And in fact, Roosevelt didn't know where he wanted to go with these issues. And in fact, in his presidency, he constantly alternated between sound money and inflation as a presidential policy. But when he refused to meet with Hoover and turned down his invitation to work together, it sent a signal to the banks that inflation was on the way, that the profligate printing of currency might start. And that fanned fears, and it led to people thinking that the banks might fail and they might lose all their deposits. So there began to be lines around the block of people clamoring to get their money out of a bank. Now, as you know, with banks, they keep only about a tenth of the amount of money on hand that they technically owe their depositors, because they know everybody isn't going to ask for it at once, and they want to use the other 90% to generate income by making loans and earning interest. So when everybody descended on the bank all at once, it couldn't honor all of the withdrawal requests, and it failed. And there were dozens and hundreds of bank failures around the United States. Henry Ford, head of Ford Motor Companies, refused to stand by the Detroit banks because he said that he didn't trust them and he wouldn't remain a depositor. And Ford Motor Company pulled out most of its deposits, and that merely accelerated this horrific failure of banks. A number of states on their own closed the banks, declared state banking holidays. And when FDR took office, a good proportion of the banks in the country had either failed or were closed, or the state had imposed a closure as a result of state proclamation. So things were pretty frosty between Roosevelt and Hoover. And they met at the White House and went to the Capitol for the swearing in, and FDR was garrulous as always and cheerful and talked and smiled, and Hoover sat there dour, staring straight ahead, not even looking at Roosevelt. And it was one of the most frosty transitions. In fact, what happened then was that Roosevelt, as soon as he took office, declared a national bank holiday, closed all of the banks. And then he told the people, I'm going to reopen them one at a time based on my audit of them to see if they're financially sound. That was largely an artifice to give people confidence and to give the banks time to recover. Eventually, rather soon, all the banks reopened. There was no more run, and deposits actually exceeded withdrawals almost from the beginning. But boy, talk about a bad presidential transition. This one caused a vast national crisis.